I moved to the edge of Alder Bend 15 years ago with one goal in mind: to leave behind the clamor of litigation rooms, policy summits, and water rights disputes, and finally let the sound of the river do the talking. After more than 2 decades working as a federal conservation consultant, most of it with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and cross-agency water protection programs, I thought I had earned the right to peace. My modest 2-story cabin sat just 70 feet from a slow-moving stretch of the Maplewood River. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. The river itself curved like a gentle spine through the land, bordered on both sides by reed sycamores and the kind of tangled willow roots that took generations to earn their place. It was protected formally under a federal riparian buffer program I had once helped draft. I knew every inch of that law, not because I memorized it, but because I lived it. Every tree branch, every sediment line, every dragonfly skimming the surface had once crossed my desk in satellite imagery or legal diagrams. And now, after years of fighting on its behalf, I could finally sit with it in silence. There's something sacred about still water. Not stagnant, no. This river was alive, but still in the sense that it didn't demand attention. It just offered it. That river healed me in more ways than I could ever explain to the people in town. I'd buried a wife, missed my daughter's entire teenage years, and sold every piece of furniture that reminded me of the courtrooms I used to spend days sleeping under. But the river never asked me to be more than I was. It just let me be. My neighbors didn't really understand why I was so protective of the land around my home. They saw it as pretty, but not sacred. So when the Homeowners Association, Mountain Pines HOA, extended its boundary map to include a sliver of land near the river's bend, I knew trouble was inching closer. Still, I didn't raise my voice, not yet. They were installing new signage, repainting benches near the trails, and making petty demands like matching mailbox colors. Annoying, yes, but harmless. Then came to Karen. Karen Lively. Yes, that was her actual name, was the newly elected HOA president, and she wore that red fleece vest like it was military regalia. She didn't just follow the rules, she invented them. And if there wasn't a rule yet, she'd scribble one down and mail it out like scripture. She had a way of speaking that mixed superiority with weaponized charm, especially when addressing anyone over 50. Her signature move was smiling while threatening you with fines. I first met her at a community meeting about trail beautification, where she proposed extending a gravel path closer to the river, complete with a small embankment improvement to stabilize the shoreline. That phrase alone made my gut knot. Embankment improvement. In federally protected floodplain. I raised my hand and calmly asked, has anyone reviewed the conservation easement on that strip? It's listed under the 2006 Watershed Agreement. That path runs right through a Class A riparian buffer. Karen laughed lightly, brushing invisible dust off her clipboard. Well, we don't want to get bogged down in technicalities now, do we? Federal conservation law isn't a technicality, I replied. She didn't respond, just moved on to the next item, her pen slashing the air. The warning signs came slow and quiet. First, the city sent a maintenance crew to survey erosion potential. Then a backhoe appeared on the HOA's shared easement road, no permits in sight. Neighbors told me Karen was planning a little river improvement to collect sand from the banks and lay it along new community trails. I knew exactly what that meant. One morning before dawn, I sat on my porch with a cup of black coffee and watched 3 large trucks roll down the gravel path near the bend. They were pulling portable suction units and pumps, dredging rigs, not small ones either. These were the kind used in small-scale riverbed mining, loud, inefficient, and about as subtle as dynamite in a church pew. The sound of those machines sent my heart rate climbing. Not because of fear, but fury. They were actually doing it. They were sucking sand straight from a federally protected riverbed. No permits, no oversight. Just red-vested Karen and her blind faith in HOA supremacy. I walked down to the bend in my work boots and cargo jacket legal folder in hand, pulse pounding not from adrenaline but memory. All those years warning developers, sitting with landowners, pulling permits, making enemies out of state politicians, And now here it was on my doorstep. Karen spotted me and smiled like we were at a Sunday barbecue. Oh, hey there, just improving the view a little. It was getting a bit overgrown. I held up a printed map and pointed to the highlighted zone. This land is registered as federally protected watershed. You're violating Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. She laughed again. I don't think the HOA falls under federal law. This is a private community project. And I've already cleared it with the landscaping committee. Federal law trumps HOA landscaping committees, I replied coldly. She turned back to her crew. Keep going. Don't stop unless he shows up with a badge. That's when I knew words weren't enough. Karen wasn't going to be swayed by logic or law. She needed pressure, real pressure. And luckily for me, I still knew where to find it. That night, I went into my study, pulled out a dusty binder marked Maplewood Watershed, 2006, and opened a legal world most people had no idea even existed. The coordinates, the protected zones, the USACE overlays, the fine print that made the difference between restoration and destruction. I wasn't just going to stop Karen. I was going to make her understand that the river speaks louder than her rules, and this time she'd have to listen. The next morning, I woke to the grinding roar of machinery echoing through the valley like war drums. It wasn't the ambient hum of distant roadwork or a neighbor mowing early. No, this was the mechanical scream of industrial pumps, high-powered suction rigs meant for moving tons of material, not gardening mulch. I stepped out onto the porch with my boots half-laced and my heart already thumping in my throat. Sure enough, 3 trucks had parked along the HOA's so-called community path, and several men were rolling out massive hoses toward the river's edge. Behind them, HOA volunteers, in their matching red vests, were standing around with clipboards, gesturing at stakes in the ground, and conferring over laminated site maps. It was absurd. If they weren't about to commit a felony, it could have been mistaken for a school science project. And there she was. Karen standing like a director in front of a film crew, barking orders with that perfectly curled blonde bob that never moved an inch, even as the wind picked up. She saw me walking down the path and raised her coffee cup like we were neighbors sharing a sunrise. Her grin told me everything she thought she was in control. Worse, she believed this was her domain. "Morning, Mr. Harlow," she called out. "Isn't it a beautiful day for progress?" I didn't answer. I was already filming with my phone. I swept it from the industrial pumps down to the river's edge where the intake pipe had been placed squarely within the shallow water, sucking like a leech at the riverbed. My eye caught the murkiness trailing downstream, the stirred sediment disrupting the natural clarity that had defined this stretch for generations. "Progress is usually legal," I muttered as I approached. She didn't flinch. "We're enhancing community access to the river. Better walking trails, a smoother embankment, a cleaner flow. Isn't that what environmentalists like you always wanted?" I took a slow breath. "You're disturbing a federally protected riparian buffer. You're in violation of Section 404 and possibly 0401 of the Clean Water Act. There are no visible permits, no flags, no oversight. You're pumping sediment and organic matter directly from the riverbed. Do you even understand the impact this has on macroinvertebrate habitats or fish spawning cycles?" She waved her hand dismissively. "We're just smoothing out a few rough edges. This part of the river is hardly pristine. It's not like anyone swims here." That stung. That casual disregard spoken like a woman who believed control was her birthright. She didn't care what lived in the river, didn't care what laws were in place. She only cared that it was visible from her back porch. "The law doesn't care whether you swim in it," I said flatly. "This river is protected because of its role in the greater watershed. What you're doing will eventually affect everything downstream. And when the EPA gets wind of this..." Karen smirked. "Oh, come on. We're just a homeowners association. I doubt the EPA is going to parachute in over a little landscaping project." She turned to a man in a yellow hard hat and waved. "Keep going. We'll need another 5 cubic yards before lunch." I could feel the blood rising in my face, the burn of helplessness I hadn't felt in years. But I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. That wasn't my weapon anymore. Instead, I stepped back, continued recording, and calmly took photos of every permitless action taking place. Close-ups of the suction pipes, the vehicle's license plates, the piles of wet sand, already accumulating on tarps 20 feet from the water. Then I went back to my cabin and opened my old federal work laptop, the one I never really retired from. First, I drafted a preliminary environmental hazard complaint and attached photographic evidence. I addressed it to 3 recipients: a senior field officer I once trained at the Mon Army Corps of Engineers, an environmental investigator I knew from my time consulting for Region 6 of the EPA, and the compliance officer for the Ohio State's Department of Environmental Quality. The subject line read, "Unauthorized dredging activity, Maplewood River HOA interference." I knew better than to expect an instant response, but within 20 minutes, one of the email addresses pinged back a read receipt. That was enough. Later that afternoon, I drove into town and stopped at the assessor's office. I requested public documents on the Mountain Pines HOA's boundaries and any pending development plans. As expected, the plans on file were vague, nothing suggesting large-scale sand extraction, just minor trail work and embankment grooming. That's the thing about bad actors, they don't lie well. They just use soft words for ugly things. On my way out, I saw 2 of the HOA board members, John Tibbett and Lisa Crane, leaving a cafe across the street. They noticed me and glanced away quickly like I was contagious. They didn't say hello, didn't ask how the river was doing. They just got into Lisa's Lexus and drove off like they already knew something was wrong. By the time I got home, the dredging rigs had doubled in volume. They were now operating 2 suction lines and a 3rd pump that was wheezing under the strain. The team had built a makeshift sand separator using plywood and mesh right there by the riverbank. Disgusting. They were mining. Let's call it what it was. I stood under the fading orange light of sunset and watched clouds of sand-laden water roll downstream. Birds that normally danced along the surface had vanished. Frogs I used to hear from my porch were silent. The living system was choking. And still Karen laughed and clapped and called it progress. So I did what people like Karen never expect. I began digging through my archives. Old topo maps, pre-construction surveys, satellite overlays from the early 2000s, when I had helped evaluate this exact river bend for protection. I even found a digital memo with my own annotations from a 2007 case, ironically titled Maplewood Buffer Integrity, Preservation Priority. That's when I realized something even bigger. The HOA wasn't just disturbing the riverbed. They were doing it on a section that was never officially conveyed to the HOA in the first place. The deed transfer had a conditional clause tied to environmental oversight, one that was never fulfilled. In simple terms, they didn't even own the land they were desecrating. That night, I filed a formal legal request to the county land office, asking for the original deed language to be reviewed. And I submitted a second violation complaint to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service since protected wetland species had been documented in the area just 6 years ago. I slept 4 hours. When I woke up, the morning river looked browner than I'd ever seen it. But something inside me had shifted, not anger, not even righteous indignation. Purpose. Karen had turned my refuge into a battleground. But she had no idea what kind of war she'd started or who she'd picked it with. I woke up the next morning to the smell of damp, silt, and earthy bitter scent that hadn't lingered this close to the house in years. The air was heavy with moisture and something else. Oil. Diesel. Grease. The byproduct of machines that didn't belong in nature. I stepped outside and sure enough, the pump trucks were already humming. The river had been reduced to a task on a clipboard, stripped of reverence, treated like a utility instead of a living thing. Karen was out there again wearing her ever-present red vest like a crown. She had a walkie-talkie clipped to her hip and a ridiculous straw hat on her head, like she was managing a resort instead of a crime scene. 2 more volunteers stood beside her neighbors I used to wave to on garbage day, now wielding clipboards, flagging distances along the bank as if they were drafting blueprints for Eden. I had hoped that my confrontation the previous day might have knocked some sense into her. That maybe somewhere deep under all the HOA arrogance and suburban delusion there existed a reasonable human being. But as I watched her direct a worker to move a pipe deeper into the current, I realized reason had left the building long ago. So I took the direct approach. I marched right back down the slope, boots crunching over broken reeds and newly exposed dirt camera already recording. Karen I called, keeping my voice steady. She turned overly cheery. "Oh, you again?" "I'm not here for another chat," I said. You're violating federal conservation statutes. Section 404, subsection C. You're actively altering a navigable waterway without a permit. You're pumping sediment into a living system. And I have now reported you to the Army Corps, the EPA, and Fish and Wildlife. I suggest you shut this down immediately. Karen blinked, as if I'd asked her to give up her favorite parking spot. Then she laughed, actually laughed, and glanced sideways at one of her board members. "I'm sorry," she said, folding her arms like she was on the cover of a home and garden magazine. "Do you work for the government?" "I used to. I helped write the policy you're breaking." "Well, unless you have a badge and a gun, I don't think you get to make that call." She turned back to her crew. "We're within HOA jurisdiction. The property line was redrawn last year, and we cleared this at the spring meeting. If you had an issue, you should have come to the vote." I almost couldn't speak. The river doesn't belong to the HOA. It belongs to the public trust. It's under federal protection. No vote can override federal environmental law. Karen didn't look back. Like I said, get a badge. It was like trying to argue with a mirror. She wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in dominance. And worse, she had convinced herself that her little patch of power made her invincible. She saw my warnings as bluster, not as the precision-guided legal strike I was preparing behind the scenes. One of her workers, a younger guy with a construction vest and earbuds, paused to look at me. There was something almost apologetic in his eyes, like he knew what they were doing wasn't right, but he was getting paid to keep his head down. I nodded at him, then turned back to Karen. "This is your last warning. When federal agents show up, I want you to remember that I tried to help you first." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Let them come. Maybe they can help carry sandbags." That was the moment I knew there would be no more talking. I returned to my house and locked the door behind me, trembling with frustration. I'd spent a lifetime navigating bureaucracies, mediating between state engineers and federal departments, and now I was being mocked by a woman whose greatest accomplishment was organizing a community chili cook-off. But the worst part, the part that truly burned, was that she had the neighborhood on her side. That afternoon, I received 3 emails and 1 voicemail. The first was from Lisa Crane, the HOA treasurer, who warned me not to spread paranoia and reminded me that I was just a resident, not an expert anymore. The second was from a neighbor, Pete Ramirez, politely suggesting that I was being too intense about this whole river thing and that Karen probably has it under control. The third was from the HOA board itself, an official notice of disturbing community harmony with a citation attached. $250 fine for uncooperative behavior. The voicemail was from an unknown number. "Mr. Harlow, this is Hot Special Agent Winstead from the EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. We've received your report and preliminary evidence. We're coordinating with USACE for an on-site inspection. Do not engage further with the individuals involved. Please confirm your availability for a field interview." I played it twice. Then I sat at my old desk, opened a fresh folder on my desktop, and titled it, HOA Dredging Case, Maplewood River, Karen Lively. I included every photo, every GPS timestamp, every map overlay I had saved since moving in. I drafted a field narrative detailing the exact chain of events and quoting Karen verbatim. I marked satellite coordinates for all visible disruption. I cross-referenced fish migration patterns, soil instability markers, and known flood risk models from the last Army Corps survey of the area. This wasn't going to be a slap on the wrist. This was going to be an environmental reckoning. The next morning, I stayed out of sight. Let them work. Let them dig their hole deeper, literally and figuratively. The more they disturbed, the more evidence I'd have. By the third day, the entire stretch behind my property had changed. The gentle curve of the bank had been chewed into a jagged shelf. Sand mounds stood like miniature tombs, leaking cloudy runoff into the river. Saplings were dead or missing. The birds, especially the killdeer, had vanished. And yet Karen smiled, posed for photos with her HOA team, and posted updates on the neighborhood Facebook page. One post read, "And riverfront upgrades are coming along beautifully. Big thanks to everyone pitching in. This is going to be a showpiece for the entire HOA." Underneath, a comment from a neighbor. "Looks amazing. Can't wait to bring the kids down there." I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. And that's when I realized It wasn't just about the law. This was about truth. Karen didn't just break regulations, she manipulated perception. She painted her violations as improvement. She wrapped illegality in charm and sold it to the community as progress. But lies like sand don't hold shape for long. They collapse. I spent the next 48 hours like a man possessed. My body barely moved beyond my desk, my kitchen table, and the edge of the river, where the damage was spreading like infection. Every moment Karen's crew operated those pumps, the river's skin tore a little deeper. Every pile of sand dumped on the trail was a new crime scene, and I documented it all with the cold, methodical instincts I'd sharpened during my government years. I wasn't just building a complaint, I was constructing a case file. I set up a game camera across from the dig site, buried it in a cluster of brush, aimed with just enough elevation to capture wide-angle evidence of the operation. Every truck, every hose, every dump of sediment, all of it was time-stamped. I synced that footage with GPS overlays from an old floodplain database I still had access to. The Army Corps had digitized most of our old records, and with a few backdoor credentials, I pulled up the original watershed integrity maps for the Maplewood Corridor. It was worse than I thought. The section of River Karen was dredging didn't just lie inside the riparian buffer, it was inside an active erosion risk zone, one that had been designated off-limits to development, excavation, or even heavy foot traffic. The sediment below that section wasn't stable enough to support weight. It was classified as delta sponge, a fragile accumulation of fine silt gravel and micro-root structures. Remove too much of it, and the bank doesn't just collapse. It can trigger a cascading trench failure, exposing underground water channels, redirecting flow, even destroying natural levees downstream. I had warned developers about this 20 years ago. Now I was watching it happen in my own backyard. Each time the pumps ran, I noted the pitch of the engine. The deeper suction came with a lower whine, and by the end of the third day, that sound was constant. They were digging far past surface sand. They were mining. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen and her crew thought they were improving the land, beautifying it. All they were doing was stealing sand dumper to cover the paths she wanted to name after herself. One of the signs even read, "Lively Loop, Future Trailhead." I had taken a photo of it while pretending to check my mail. Her ego was printed in vinyl. But ego doesn't override hydrology. That evening, I sent the first formal digital file package to the EPA's Regional Compliance Division. I included 63 high-res images, 18 minutes of time-lapse video, a topographic overlay with confirmed encroachment, 3 public HOA communications with contradictory permit claims, the original 2007 conservation easement language signed by both the Watt County and the U.S. Department of the Interior. Within 6 hours, I received confirmation. Your documentation is being reviewed. Site visit scheduled within 48 hours. You may be contacted for field coordination. I exhaled for the first time in days. But peace was fleeting. That same night as I sat eating dinner on my porch, 2 figures from the HOA board came walking down the road. John Tibbett and Lisa Crane. I hadn't spoken to them in years, not since the debate over removing a native oak tree from a common lot. Their faces were strained with performative friendliness. "Evenin'," Nate John said, nodding at me like we were old war buddies. Lisa smiled too tightly. "Just thought we'd drop by to see how everything's going. Looks like a lot of excitement near your property lately." I put my fork down. "Is that what we're calling it?" Lisa chuckled nervously. Karen said, "You've got concerns, but we really think it's going to be a great improvement. Safer trails, better access, less erosion." Less erosion. I repeated, standing. "She's pumping directly from the riverbed. You know what that does to an active buffer system." John held up his hands. "Hey, we're not the experts here. I am the expert here." The air stiffened. Lisa glanced toward the dig site like it might back her up. "Karen also mentioned you might have been taking photos of the volunteers," she said, trying to sound neutral. "That makes some folks uncomfortable." I narrowed my eyes. "They're conducting industrial work on a federally protected waterway. That's not a neighborhood project, it's a violation." John sighed. "Listen, Nate, none of us want a feud here. Maybe we can all just agree to let the project finish and sort things out afterward." There's no need to escalate. No, I said quietly. This is exactly the time to escalate. I didn't invite them inside. I didn't offer coffee. They left after a few awkward goodbyes, but the message was clear. The HOA knew what I was doing, and they were trying to head me off before things got worse for them. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just filing a complaint. I was initiating an interagency environmental incident review, and it had already moved beyond my hands. The next morning, something shifted. The trucks were parked farther from the river, the pumps not running. A temporary halt. Maybe they were nervous. Maybe Karen was finally worried. Or maybe she thought she could clean up just enough to pass muster. Too late. At 10:42 a.m., two black government SUVs pulled into the cul-de-sac. They had no markings, but I recognized the build. One was federal, the other state. A tall man stepped out first, gray windbreaker, clipboard, radio at his shoulder. The other was a woman in an EPA vest, already snapping photos before she reached the bank. Karen came storming out of her house, trying to project confidence. "Excuse me, can I help you?" "Federal inspection," the man said simply. "We've received multiple credible reports of unauthorized activity in a protected zone. Please stand aside." Karen froze, literally froze. No words, no clipboard, just the slow realization that her world had shifted, that her vest didn't grant her immunity. From the porch, I watched her face drain of color. I sipped my coffee and whispered to myself, they came. And for the first time in a week, the river ran silent again. The federal agents didn't waste time. While Karen stood there, stiff as a fence post, one of the inspectors crossed the grass toward the dredging setup, stepping carefully around the hoses like they were live wires. Another agent snapped photographs from multiple angles, focusing on the disturbed shoreline, the sand piles, the silt plumes still drifting from the river's edge. The EPA officer wore sunglasses, but I could tell by her posture that she already didn't like what she saw. Karen finally found her voice. "I don't believe this is necessary. We're just doing minor landscaping. The HOA has full jurisdiction over this trail." The male agent, Agent Sawyer, as I later learned, barely looked up. "You're excavating within a federally regulated riparian zone. That puts you under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Do you have a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers?" Karen sputtered. "We have, community approval." The board voted no, the EPA agent said, cutting her off sharply. "Federal waters do not fall under HOA authority. Your vote doesn't supersede federal environmental law." Her voice was calm but cold, like a razor dipped in ice water. I stayed on my porch, careful not to interfere, but close enough to hear. My hands trembled not from fear, but from the pent-up tension finally releasing like a pressure valve hissing open. The storm I'd been warning about had finally broken overhead, and now Karen was the one drenched. Agent Sawyer gestured toward one of the workers. "Who's the site supervisor?" The man, clearly rattled, stammered, I just run the pump. Karen's in charge. She hired us." Karen spun around. "Don't say anything else." Agent Sawyer turned to her. "Ma'am, I advise you to cease all operations immediately. If you obstruct this inspection or interfere with witnesses, you could be subject to additional penalties under Title 18. Her mouth opened, then closed. They handed her a document. "This is a formal cease and desist order, effective immediately. You are to halt all work on this site until further notice." She took the paper like it was radioactive, holding it by the corner. "Do you have identification?" she asked weakly. The woman pulled her badge. "Environmental Protection Agency, Federal Enforcement Branch." I couldn't help but smile. Karen turned her eyes toward my porch. She didn't speak, but the hatred in her stare was unmistakable. In that moment, she knew. This hadn't just happened. Someone had caused it. And that someone was me. By noon, the worksite was vacated. Trucks were ordered off the premises, the pumps rolled up and chained. Bright orange tape was strung along the bank, marking it as an active federal investigation zone. It looked like a crime scene because in a very real way, it was. Later that afternoon, as the sun drifted west, I walked down to the edge of my property and surveyed the damage. The river was still flowing, but not the way it used to. The water was darker, carrying silt long past where the filtration reeds used to live. The erosion on the HOA side was worse than I feared. Without the root systems to stabilize the slope, the earth had started to fold inward. Cracks zigzagged along the trail like fault lines in miniature. Two of the newly planted benches now tilted toward the water, their legs swallowed halfway by the collapsing soil. And then, just as I knelt to inspect a mudslide area, I heard a low groan. At first I thought it was the wind. But then, the bank gave way. A full 5-foot section of trail disintegrated like a sandcastle. Grass, dirt, concrete, edge it all collapsed into the river with a muffled splash. One of the benches went with it, sucked down like a ship's bow, breaching in slow motion. The water frothed and foamed, then stilled, but the bank was gone. I stepped back, heart pounding. The destruction wasn't just visual anymore. It was real, measurable, physical. And it was accelerating. I sent the new footage straight to Agent Winstead and copied the Army Corps contact on the thread. Subject line, bank collapse at ceased site, urgent. Their reply came 30 minutes later. We've seen enough. Full enforcement proceedings being prepared. Please remain available for a formal deposition. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. The river was claiming its due. The next few days were quiet, in the way a battlefield is quiet after the smoke settles. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Her red vest brigade dispersed like dry leaves in wind. Even the HOA newsletter, usually bloated with potluck reminders and fine threats, arrived blank that week. Just a small note that read, "Community update pending legal review." I knew what that meant. The board was scrambling. The fines hadn't even been issued yet, but the panic had already set in. Then came the letters. First, from the EPA, an official notice of investigation requesting a formal statement and records related to the HOA's dredging activity. Second, from the Army Corps, confirmation of jurisdictional determination and potential Section 404 violations. And third, from the County Assessor's Office, an inquiry into land ownership discrepancies related to the HOA's trail extensions. Apparently, my note about the incomplete deed transfer had sparked a secondary audit. Karen had kicked a hornet's nest, and now, for the first time, she had no idea where the stings would come from. That evening, as I stood near the now-closed riverbank, a group of neighbors approached. I recognized them. Ellen, Pete, Marvin. The same folks who used to nod politely at HOA meetings and ignore me when I raised environmental concerns. But their faces were different now. They looked nervous, contrite. "We didn't know it was that serious," Ellen said, her voice soft. "We thought you were just exaggerating," Pete added, not meeting my eyes. Marvin, usually a joker, was dead quiet. I didn't gloat. I didn't say I told you so. I just nodded. "It's never just about sand," I said. "It's about systems. And what happens when we ignore the ones meant to protect us." They left with their heads bowed. For the first time since this began, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not even relief. Sadness. Because I hadn't wanted to fight my neighbors. I hadn't wanted to become the old crank with maps and warnings. All I wanted was to protect the river. But Karen made that impossible. And now, as the sun dipped low and the bank crumbled 1 inch deeper, I wondered how much more would have to collapse before they finally understood. It was strange, really, how quickly everything fell silent after the collapse. The mechanical roar of pumps, the constant grind of truck tires on gravel, even the clipped chatter of HOA volunteers. All of it disappeared like someone had pulled the plug on an artificial world. But the river never stopped. It whispered, hissed, flowed, and reminded me every morning that it was still wounded. By now, orange caution tape curled in the breeze like warning flags. The makeshift trail was blocked off with thin plastic fencing that wouldn't hold back a toddler, let alone a landslide. And still, the river kept cutting. I walked the bank every day, camera in hand, boots sinking deeper into soft mud that hadn't dried in days. The trench where the bench had fallen was now twice as wide, and the exposed roots of 2 sycamore trees jutted out like ribs from an open wound. What was once a gradual slope of grass and ferns was now a vertical wall of raw hemorrhaging earth. And the silence wasn't just outside, it was inside the HOA too. No one called. No one came by. No threats in my mailbox. No more snide notes taped to my fence. Karen had gone radio silent, and the rest of the board scattered like pigeons. But silence was never safety. It was often a sign of regrouping. I had seen it before in city councils and private developers, even inside federal agencies. When the weight of accountability started pressing on the wrong side of a budget, that's why I didn't relax. I went to work. I made calls not to lawyers, not yet. I called people who didn't need to Google my name to know what I used to do. First was Henry Wu, an old Army Corps colleague who now worked at the regional enforcement branch. We hadn't spoken in years, but the moment I mentioned Maplewood, he let out a low whistle. "I saw your name come across my desk last week," he said. "Didn't expect you to be in the middle of it." "Didn't expect to be," I replied, "but here we are." They dug up a section of a Delta sponge, Henry. They hit active filtration routes. I've got collapse footage. There was a pause on the line. "Send it to me, all of it. I'll make sure it lands where it needs to." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. In the core, silence meant things were moving. Then I called Carla Sanchez, a legal analyst with the EPA, whom I'd mentored briefly during my final year before retirement. She had grit fire and a brain that could untangle 5 overlapping statutes before breakfast. "You're not going to believe this," she said when I explained. "They're not just in violation of the Clean Water Act. If they hired unlicensed operators and didn't disclose land ownership, they might also be triggering NUPE clauses. And if species habitats were disturbed, especially amphibians, we're talking possible ESA involvement." "Endangered Species Act," one asked. "Potentially. I'll cross-check with Fish and Wildlife." She paused, then added, "You know this isn't going away, right?" Not quietly. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. That's the point. I spent the next 4 days compiling documents with the efficiency of a man who'd done this in far more hostile settings. I built out the timeline from Karen's first HOA memo to the moment federal agents arrived. Every email, every Facebook post, every invoice I could locate through public records went into the file. And just as I'd predicted, the retaliation came, but not from Karen. It came from the HOA legal counsel. A thick envelope arrived by courier. Inside, a cease and desist letter addressed to me citing defamation, harassment, and unauthorized surveillance. They accused me of spreading false information, damaging the HOA's reputation, and most laughably, undermining community unity. It read like a tantrum dressed in legalese. I laughed out loud. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I scanned the document marked inconsistencies and forwarded it to Carla. "Bluff," she replied. "Ignore. If they push, we'll file counter-litigation for retaliatory action under environmental whistleblower protections." That same night, a younger couple from down the road stopped by my front gate. I remembered them vaguely. Bryce and Tanya. They'd moved in 2 years ago, friendly enough, though quiet. "We just wanted to say thank you," Bryce said, twisting his baseball cap in his hands. "We didn't know any of that about the river. We figured the HOA had it handled," Tanya added. "Karen always made it sound like you were just difficult." "That's usually what people say when you're in their way," I said, not unkindly. "We signed the petition," Bryce added. "The one circulating to remove the board. There are over 70 signatures now. I think people are starting to see." That startled me. I didn't know there was a petition. He grinned. "Started by Marvin." After the bench collapsed, he said he couldn't keep defending her anymore. I watched them walk away and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath my ribs. Hope! The next morning, I was reviewing soil displacement models when I heard a knock. I opened the door and found Agent Winstead on my porch, this time without his team. Just a folder under his arm and a pair of mirrored sunglasses tucked into his collar. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He sat at my kitchen table like he'd done it 100 times. "We're moving into the formal enforcement phase. Civil penalties, possibly criminal, for falsified documents. We'll need your deposition next week." "I'm ready." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else. We found evidence of fill material being dumped beyond the dredging zone. Cement mix, crushed gravel. Not just sand. Looks like they were preparing for construction." I felt the air suck from my chest. "Are you saying they were going to build something?" "Looks that way. Possibly an outdoor pavilion, maybe even a dock." The plans were never filed with the county, but we pulled drone images showing layout markers. "They never mentioned that at any meetings," I said. "Never." He nodded. "You were right to act. If that had gone through, the ecological damage would have been exponential." He stood, folder in hand. "Thanks for protecting the river. Not many people do anymore." As I closed the door behind him, I looked back out toward the water. The river was bruised, but alive. And the fight wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about truth. About people learning that nature doesn't negotiate. It endures or it disappears. And if I had anything to say about it, this river wasn't going anywhere. The sky was oddly clear the morning Karen's kingdom began to collapse in full view. No clouds, no breeze. Just a pale blue canvas stretched wide above the neighborhood she once ruled with a laminated bylaws binder and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. You could almost hear the unease rolling through the community like distant thunder even before the black SUVs returned. But this time they weren't alone. A marked EPA vehicle led the convoy, followed by two state DEQO trucks, and a third car bearing the seal of the HOA U.S. Department of the Interior. It pulled into the HOA's main office lot, which Karen had once proudly remodeled into a community resource hub by gutting what used to be the maintenance shed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. That building now stood as the center of an environmental investigation zone, roped off and under federal scrutiny. I watched it unfold from my front porch, coffee in hand, just as I had the first time the agents arrived. But now, something had shifted. The neighborhood wasn't whispering about me anymore. They were whispering about her. By mid-morning, the scene was in full motion. Agents carted boxes out of the HOA office files, receipts, hard drives. An evidence technician photographed the interior. Another posted a legal notice to the glass door. Notice of investigation. All operations suspended pending review. Bold red letters, unmissable. Karen finally emerged 2 hours in her posture, brittle mouth tight. She looked like a realtor trying to smile through a foreclosure, but her usual polish had cracks now. No clipboard, no minions, no chirpy greetings. Just that look tight, suspicious, wounded. Her eyes met mine for a long second across the quiet street, and then she looked away. Not a word, not a challenge. She knew. Later that afternoon, the federal agents held a private meeting at the City Council Annex. Not public, not yet, but word got out fast. 2 members of the HOA board were subpoenaed to testify about what they knew and when they knew it. Rumors swirled that Karen had signed off on the dredging without any formal vote. Worse, she'd submitted a falsified summary of environmental compliance to justify the project. Something about a landscaping memo doctored to look like county approval. But this wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was fraud. EPA agents conducted interviews for 3 straight days. Residents were asked to provide emails, Facebook messages, any documentation tied to THA's project. Several came to me directly asking for help interpreting what they had. I became, in a strange and poetic twist, the village translator for legalese, for guilt for truth. On the 4th day, the official charges were posted online. Unauthorized alteration of a federally protected waterway. Violation of the Clean Water Act, Section 404, submission of falsified environmental clearance documents. Failure to obtain proper local and federal construction permits. Negligent endangerment of a riparian buffer zone. The fines alone were staggering hundreds of thousands in civil penalties. The HOA's insurance provider pulled out immediately. Their legal counsel resigned. Special audits were triggered for their spending history. And just like that, the polished exterior of HOA authority cracked wide open. But the most significant blow came not from the law, but from the people. At an emergency neighborhood meeting held in the local elementary gymnasium, over 120 residents showed up. The air was thick with unease, folding chairs scraping the floor, the echo of hushed voices. The kind of tension that only comes from betrayal. Karen tried to speak first. She stood behind the microphone, like she still owned it, tapping the bass once to silence the crowd. "I understand there have been misunderstandings," she began. Someone in the back shouted. "Misunderstandings don't come with subpoenas." Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and bitter. Karen held her ground. "This project was always meant to beautify our community. I did what I thought was best. For your name on a trail sign," someone else yelled. "You cost us everything." The HOA treasurer, Lisa Crane, stood next. She looked pale and tired. No makeup, no pearls. Just the exhausted face of someone finally done lying. "I was asked to sign off on a purchase order." "I didn't understand," she said into the mic. "Karen told me it was just for gravel. I didn't know we were dredging a river. I didn't know it was protected." That was the first crack. Then Marvin spoke, his voice quiet but devastating. "I helped stake out that trail. I laid those flags. But I never saw a permit, not once." The silence was thick enough to drown in. Finally, a motion was raised from the audience. Vote of no confidence. The results weren't close. Karen was removed from office in under 4 minutes. Her seat on the board her presidency, her role as the mouthpiece of Mountain Pines. Gone. She stood there, frozen hands trembling, eyes wide as the room moved on without her. I don't think she expected it to happen like that. Not in public, not in the school gym, not in front of the people who used to smile and wave and nod obediently at her every idea. She turned and walked out without a word. I stayed seated. No applause, no celebration. Because justice when real doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like weight being lifted. A few days later, restoration teams arrived at the river. Not HOA landscapers, real professionals. Under EPA oversight, they began assessing how much damage could be reversed. Biologists took soil samples. Engineers examined the bank. A hydrologist I'd once worked with back in '09 recognized me and waved. "Didn't think I'd see you back in the field," he said. "I never really left," I replied. Karen's red vest disappeared from the neighborhood. Rumor had it she moved in with a cousin in Shelm, South Carolina, to get away from all the toxic energy. No one missed her. The board was restructured with new members who promised transparency, legal compliance, and most importantly, respect for the land we lived on. I still walked the riverbank every morning. It would take months, maybe years, for the river to fully recover. But for the first time in a long while, I believed it could. The water was clearer. Birds had returned. And a chorus of frogs I hadn't heard in weeks croaked from the reeds one sunrise, as if welcoming me back. Not as a watchdog, not as a whistleblower, but as what I always wanted to be, a neighbor. I'd testified before. In fact, I'd sat in front of more microphones, more wood-paneled benches, more water pitchers, and stern-faced chairs than I could count. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't about someone else's mess. It was my river, my home, my community. And the damage wasn't theoretical. It was visible in the gouged riverbank, in the poisoned reeds, in the quiet absence of creatures that used to sing me awake. I was called into this deposition on a Wednesday morning. EPA headquarters had coordinated with the Walt State's Environmental Justice Division to hold a formal hearing in the county courthouse. The room was small, packed with legal staff, 2 reporters, and 3 HOA board members under subpoena. Karen was not among them. They had her statements, her signed documents, her emails. They didn't need her anymore. I wore a simple button-up shirt and carried a brown binder tucked under my arm. Nothing flashy, just printed photos, field notes, time-stamped surveillance logs, and an annotated map of the Maplewood floodplain from 2007 with my initials in the margin because I had been the one who wrote the original designation. The chairwoman, a soft-spoken woman with steel in her gaze, nodded as I was sworn in. "Mr. Harlow," she said, "you're a retired federal environmental compliance officer. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," I answered. With field work across 8 watersheds and multiple contributions to the riparian buffer guidelines now used nationally. "And you currently reside adjacent to the Maplewood River." "I do. I've lived there for 15 years. I selected the property specifically because of its proximity to a protected ecosystem. And is it your understanding that the section of riverbank disturbed by the HOA's project falls within federal jurisdiction?" I opened my binder, pulled out the map, and held it up. I helped write the designation for this section. The coordinates of the dredging activity fall squarely within the federally protected buffer. No activity involving excavation, sediment extraction, or shoreline alteration may occur here without a Section 404 permit issued by the Army Corps of Engineers. That permit was never filed. She leaned forward. "How do you know that?" "Because I checked the online registry, the internal compliance database, and spoke directly with Henry Wu, a federal field agent currently assigned to this case." Murmurs fluttered in the back of the room. John Tibbet shrunk into his chair. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. The EPA counsel continued. "Mr. Harlow, what was your involvement in documenting the activity?" I laid the evidence out clearly. The game camera footage, daily logs, GPS-coordinated photos, community memos, witness statements. I narrated it like a case report, not to boast, but to be precise. Because I knew precision was what would nail this down. The final blow came when I presented a screenshot from the HOA's internal newsletter. A post written by Karen herself bragging about the project's river enhancements and thanking her dear friends at Wash County Works for fast-tracking our site greenlight. Only problem was, County Works had no record of it. That was already in the file. But seeing her words in her own cheery tone printed and read aloud, under oath, changed the mood of the room. What had once been a story of community misjudgment snapped into place as something much clearer. Intentional misrepresentation. Possibly criminal. When I stepped down, the chairwoman nodded with quiet gratitude. "You've done your part, Mr. Harlow." That night, I walked the trail behind my house. Alone. The caution tape was gone, but the damage remained. Every erosion trench, every mangled root, every ugly scar across the slope, it all told a story. And yet, I noticed something new. Small green shoots, tiny blades of grass, poking up where devastation had flattened the earth just weeks before. Near the bend where the sediment had poured into the river, a thin film of moss was beginning to reestablish. Life was trying again. Despite the machines, despite the arrogance, despite the human meddling, the following week the public penalties were announced. The Mountain Pines HOA was ordered to pay for $12,000 in federal fines, $95,000 in state remediation fees, an additional $60,000 in private property damages to 3 adjacent homeowners, including myself. More significantly, the board was mandated to place the entire river corridor under third-party ecological management for a period of no less than 5 years. That meant they couldn't touch a single shrub without clearance. Karen's name was listed in the EPA's public release. Her role was clearly outlined: project initiator, willful noncompliance, false documentation, obstruction of inquiry. While no criminal charges were filed yet, she was barred from serving on any neighborhood governance structure for at least 10 years. The HOA's website went dark the same day. Lisa Crane resigned shortly after. The community was stunned, but there were small sparks of clarity blooming through the disillusionment. Marvin, the same man who'd staked flags on the trail, started organizing river cleanups. Tanya and Bryce built a community bulletin board, real wood, no HOA branding, and pinned the words, "Protect what protects us," across the top in red paint. And one afternoon, as I returned from town, I found a ceramic sign left by my mailbox. Handmade. Glazed in greens and blues, it read, "The river has a voice. Thank you for listening." No signature. Didn't need one. I hung it on the fence, where Karen used to tape her violation notices. In the weeks that followed, the energy in the neighborhood shifted. Not fast, not perfectly, but noticeably. People began to greet me again, not with suspicion, but with respect. The same people who had once mocked my concern now asked about the wildlife, about the runoff, about what plants they should avoid disturbing. And maybe most surprising of all, they listened. Because sometimes change doesn't come with a crash. It comes in the stillness after. The part where you learn what matters by witnessing what you nearly lost. For a moment, it seemed like peace had finally returned to our neighborhood. The air along the river began to smell sweet again, like grass instead of diesel. Kids rode their bikes near the preserved trailhead without parents shouting about fines. People waved at one another, not with fear or obligation, but as neighbors do when they feel something genuine between them. But it didn't last, because some people, when faced with accountability, don't take the lesson. They reach for control. 2 weeks after the EPA's penalties were made public, I received an envelope that looked like junk mail. No return address, just my name and lot number handwritten. Inside, folded in crisp thirds, was a new notice of non-compliance from the HOA. Apparently, my back fence was 1.7 inches taller than the approved height regulation under Wushall Article 14D of the Community Code. The letter informed me that failure to remedy the violation within 7 calendar days would result in a all $500 fine and possible legal escalation. I laughed out loud. Then I read the next line. Additionally, your exterior lighting fixture is non-uniform and must match HOA standard bronze. That's when I stopped laughing, because this wasn't just bureaucratic busywork. It was retaliation. The new interim president, a quiet man named Harold Griggs, had been one of Karen's staunchest supporters. Though he hadn't spoken much during her reign, he had nodded when she spoke, signed whatever she passed around, and mowed his lawn every Saturday at exactly 800 a.m. If Karen had been the mouth, Harold had been the spine. Now she was gone and he was flexing. I received 2 more notices over the following week. One about my unapproved natural grasses near the riverbank grass that I hadn't planted that had grown on its own during restoration. The second cited me for having a non-regulation rain barrel. That rain barrel had been there for 5 years, untouched. It became clear they weren't punishing me for grass or fences. They were punishing me for speaking, for winning. I had choices. Ignore them, let them pile on fake citations, or fight back again. But this time I didn't go to war alone. I called Tanya and Bryce, then Marvin, then Ellen. We met in my living room, sat around the same table where I had compiled the original EPA dossier. This isn't just about me, I said. They're using the rules to punish dissent. Bryce nodded. It's like they're trying to rebuild Karen's little empire one form at a time. I've got half a mind to start a community committee, Ellen said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. You mean like a counterboard, Tanya asked. No, I replied. Not a board, something better. We called it the Riverwatch Collective, a neighborhood group independent of HOA structure dedicated to transparency, environmental care, and legal oversight. We weren't rebels. We weren't radicals. We were residents who wanted to live without fear of manufactured violations or the threat of petty fines. Within 2 weeks, the group had 35 members. We held our first public meeting under the sycamores behind my house. Someone brought folding chairs. Another brought lemonade. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were doing what the HOA claimed to stand for: community. Meanwhile, I responded to every single violation notice I received, with legal citations, with dated photographs, with copies of the county code, and federal exemptions tied to protected buffer zones. The fence height issue exempt under variance due to floodplain grading. The grass federally seeded as part of the EPA-approved restoration project. The rain barrel installed before the HOA had even drafted its water conservation clause, grandfathered in. I didn't just reply, I copied the Watt State's HOA regulatory board on every response. I was no longer playing defense. I filed a formal complaint against the HOA for retaliatory action against a whistleblower citing Section 712.305 of Florida's Homeowners Association statutes, because I knew where the real teeth were buried in the law. And the board knew it too. The response was almost immediate. The next HOA newsletter, now comically thin, included a generic statement about clarifying existing violations and reviewing past compliance procedures. No apology, of course. No admission. But the letters stopped. The fines disappeared. And then Harold Griggs resigned. No press, no speech. Just an empty parking space outside the HOA office and a one-sentence email sent to residents: due to health concerns and ongoing neighborhood pressures, I am stepping down effective immediately. I didn't cheer, because by then, I had learned something vital. The river didn't need a hero. It needed a witness, a defender, someone willing to look beneath the surface and say, this isn't okay, and I won't pretend it is. The HOA, now gutted and demoralized, called for an emergency election. I didn't run. I nominated Ellen instead. She won by a landslide. The first thing she did, suspend all pending fines until a third-party audit could be conducted. The second, she appointed Marvin as the new environmental compliance liaison, an unpaid role but one that gave him a voice, a purpose, and perhaps most importantly, a path to redemption. A week later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, not from the HOA, not from the government. It was handwritten, no envelope. Nate, I was wrong. About the river, about you. I see it now. Karen fooled a lot of us. I let her fool me. Thank you for not giving up, John. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my field journal. Then I walked to the water. The sycamores still leaned toward the flow as if listening. The reeds had begun to hum again with the sound of frogs and insects. The slope was still raw but stable. Healing. And for the first time, I sat by the river and didn't feel like a soldier watching the line. I just felt like a man who came home. Autumn came slow to Alder Bend that year. The heat of the long, bitter summer finally released its grip, and the river, scarred but resilient, flowed with a new steadiness. Leaves turned amber above the banks. Cool mist hovered in the mornings. Nature, in its quiet mercy, began to cover the bruises left by human hands. But for those of us who had lived through what happened, the land held memory, and that memory changed everything. The Riverwatch Collective grew larger than I ever expected. We weren't activists. We weren't idealists. We were gardeners, teachers, mechanics, veterans, single mothers, just neighbors. But the river had given us something unexpected: common ground. Every other Saturday, we met to walk the trails, pick up litter, document growth, replant natives. Marvin brought his binoculars and started a wildlife log. Tanya sketched bird species in a notebook for her daughter. Bryce built a bench, this one firmly outside the flood zone, with the words, "Stand still and listen. carved into the wood. The kids who used to be shushed near the water now learned the names of trees. The old-timers who once ignored each other on trash day began showing up with thermoses of coffee happy just to sit and breathe in the sound of running water. It wasn't a revolution. It was a return. The HOA, meanwhile, underwent a complete restructuring. Under Ellen's leadership, they shifted focus from rule enforcement to education, from fines to dialogue. One of the first resolutions passed under the new board was a permanent ban on any excavation or construction within 200 feet of the riparian edge. It was symbolic, sure. The law already made it illegal, but the fact that the HOA now chose to reinforce those protections meant something. More than that, it meant people had learned. Karen never returned. Her name slowly faded from community forums. Her trail sign was quietly removed and replaced with a modest wooden post that read, "Maplewood River Trail, Protected Zone. Tread lightly. Listen closely. Leave no harm." That last line was mine. They asked me to write it. For a while, I resisted speaking publicly about what happened. I declined interviews, turned down podcast invitations, said no to the county commissioner's offer to make me an environmental honorary liaison. I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to be whole. But then, one day, a fourth-grade teacher from the local school knocked on my door. Her class had been studying local ecosystems, and she asked if I would be willing to talk to the kids. Just a little presentation on what the river meant and why it mattered. I told her I'd think about it. That night, I walked the trail behind my home, the one that had once been marked for destruction. I sat at Bryce's bench, watched the water carry leaves downriver the way time carries memory, not lost, just moving. I thought about all of it. About the moment Karen laughed in my face. About the bench collapsing into the current. About the men in black SUVs, the subpoenas, the whispered apologies, the quiet justice. I thought about the old me, the man who used to believe his fight was done. That retirement meant retreat, that he had no more rivers left to protect. And then I thought about what the river had taught me. That healing isn't passive. That peace isn't given. It's earned. So I said yes. The kids showed up one morning in October, bundled in jackets and wide-eyed, holding notebooks and pencils like explorers. I walked them to the bend in the river and told them about root systems, about frogs that breathe through their skin, about how soil isn't just dirt, but a living archive. I told them how water remembers where it's been, how every ripple is a response to something upstream. And I told them the truth, that people, adults, sometimes forget how to listen, that sometimes they confuse control with care, and that it's up to the next generation to remember. This river doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. One of the kids raised his hand. "Did you build this river?" I smiled. "Nobody. But I learned how to protect it." The next day they sent thank you cards. One of them had a drawing of a tree with roots that reached all the way to the bottom of the page. Below it, in blue crayon letters, was written, "Well, thank you for being the roots that held the river." I kept that one, framed it, hung it beside the old map of the watershed, the one with my initials in the corner back when I still thought of rivers as data and not as memory. Now, when people ask me what happened that summer when they hear the headlines or stumble across the articles, I don't talk about the fines, or the hearings, or Karen. I tell them this. There was once a river that almost disappeared because people forgot how precious it was. But it didn't, because someone stood still, because someone listened, because someone said no more. And that, more than any law, any board, any badge, is what saved it. So now I live beside a river that runs deeper than it ever did. Not because it grew, but because it was finally seen. And maybe, just maybe, because we learned to stop sucking the life out of what was never ours to take.